Prohibition is one of the most thought of time periods in American history. But not many people know how it started, how people quickly turned against it, and how it influenced crime and corruption throughout the country. But to really dig deep into the debate, failures, and consequences of Prohibition, we have to look into its past, how it started, and who were the key players in it. One of these key players was Wayne Wheeler, who was permanently injured by a drunken, pitchfork-wielding farmhand on his family farm. From a young age, this solidified his hatred for alcohol and drove him to lead the biggest prohibition movement of all time, called the Anti-Saloon League, which would eventually present the idea of prohibition to Congress. The second major player, or players, was the Women's Christian Temperance Union, which had been a thing since the 1850s. This movement was mostly led by women who all had similar stories about how their husbands would come home drunk and abuse their wives and children. They also said that their husbands would waste their money on drink and would be a bad influence on their sons. But don't get it twisted. Not everyone was supportive of Prohibition, especially the people in the North, in which alcohol distilleries not only made up most of the jobs for immigrants coming into the U.S., but it also contributed up to 40% of American tax dollars. The Dry Party eventually won this argument using 4 things. One of these was pressure politics, in which powerful organizations like the Anti-Saloon League would get any politicians who did not support the law ousted from government. The second way was the use of propaganda, which presented alcohol as evil and life-ruining. The third way is that they used anti-German sentiment created by World War I to target a lot of the big brewing companies in America who were German-owned. And the last way was that Wayne Wheeler and his supporters introduced a new income tax that would supplement the tax dollars lost from outlawing alcohol. This, combined with other social factors, brought Prohibition to Congress and signed it into law. Even though this was happening, the support for Prohibition was still going strong, and many people still thought it would be a success and limit crime, with tens of thousands of people still standing against it. A lot of these people include the thousands of immigrants and lower-class citizens who were laid off from their jobs, and because most of them were uneducated, they had to resort to non-legal ways to make their money. Crime gangs and the mafia had been around since the 1910s, and during the early days of Prohibition, they immediately saw a way to make a lot of money. And seeing this money come in made other people join them in hopes of becoming rich. Most of the people who joined were lower-class citizens and immigrants who needed to make money in their financial hardship. The second group of people were the liberals, who stated that Prohibition was unconstitutional and that it got rid of people's private right to drink alcohol, which to them was harmless. Then, all across America's big cities, crime started to pick up as immigrants and the lower-class gangs started to sell alcohol to the people who wanted it most. There were Irish gangs, Italian gangs, Scottish gangs, Polish gangs, German gangs, and Jewish gangs, all focused on achieving one goal: to make the most money. Gangs were not the only way that people scored illegal booze, as the Volstead Act, written by none other than Wayne Wheeler himself, was more draconian than many people expected, as prescription alcohol was allowed and doctors became bartenders, and as religious places were also allowed to keep alcohol, like churches. Rabbis were also allowed to have alcohol, and now everyone was becoming a rabbi. What were the police officers doing to enforce the law? They were still there, right? And the answer is yes, but they're completely ineffective at stopping the increasing crime in the streets. This was because big gangsters like Al Capone, who were making up to $100 million a year from trading illegal liquor, and it wouldn't hurt their profits to give a couple $1,000s to the police chief or the mayor or anyone else that stood in the way of them making all that money. This was the peak of corruption in America, and some officers were making just as much as the bootleggers by just not opening their mouth. Where bootleggers were making millions by selling alcohol to the masses and running secret bars called speakeasies. Police officers and public officials were making just as much money as these criminals, just by not ratting them out. And these bootleggers, people who happily killed one another just to consolidate power, were loved by the American people, as the news regularly featured them as heroes. They were so loved that when a bootlegger named George Remus killed his wife and her lover, and then turned himself in for murder, he was found innocent. Soon, the government came up with the idea of adding poison to a lot of the ingredients that these people were using, and many died because of it. The government was also issuing out harsh sentences to anyone who violated the law. An example of this was when a Michigan mother was sentenced to life in prison for small-scale moonshining. However, in 1929, public opinion about these bootleggers and gangsters started to change, with the Valentine's Day Massacre, a brutal execution of 7 members of Chicago's North Side Gang. More people were already turning against Prohibition, with the gun battles they saw in the streets and the corruption they saw in the government. But these events segmented in the minds of many Americans that Prohibition was not the right thing moving forward. And it was this type of violence that turned many against the law and called into question its effectiveness. But most importantly, it showed New York socialite named Pauline Sabin, a woman with powerful business and political ties, that Prohibition was dangerous and horrible, ultimately inspiring her to create the Women's Organization for National Prohibition Reform. Once a strong proponent of Prohibition, she was now calling for its end. Then, the final nail in the 18th Amendment's coffin came with the Great Depression, where people were losing their jobs and having their homes repossessed. The last thing they were worrying about was if alcohol was legal or not. Because of all these factors, on December 5th, 1933, Prohibition was finally repealed, and the happy American people celebrated like they had just won a world war. So in the end, Prohibition was the great social experiment and accomplished nothing but gang violence, increased crime, and corruption in the government.